really quickly.
Hi, I'm Lori Hicks. I'm the Local Government and Judicial Systems Audit Director here at the Auditor of Public Accounts.
Hi, and I'm Martha Mavridis. I'm the Virginia Auditor of Public Accounts. We appreciate this opportunity for Rachel to present some information about our process today. We're kind of the new kids on the block with this. When we started looking at doing a fiscal distress model, we did some research on what other states were doing and have tried to learn from things that we've seen there and work within the constraints that we needed to work within here in Virginia. One of the big things that we've focused on is in Virginia, the localities don't appreciate additional state mandates passed down to them, and so we've tried to use information that they already pass along to us in the form of their CAFR and some other information that we use in our oversight, so that we're not creating an additional burden for localities, especially ones that might be distressed, that we can use information we already have. Like Rachel started out saying, our office, most of what we do is actually financial audits of state agencies and institutions. Years ago, back in the 80s, we did audits of localities, but that's changed now so that all the localities now are audited by CPA firms that they are responsible to hire and have come in and do the audit, but then they send us copies of their CAFR and send us some additional information that we use to do some comparative report. And so we've kind of built our fiscal stress model using that information that we already have and that we get through that oversight process that we have. But Rachel is our guru for this. She's been the one in the trenches digging through, and so we're going to let her go through and kind of explain our process and how we've gotten to where we are.
Thanks, Martha. And quickly on this slide too, you can see down at the bottom if there's any other offices on the call that use Twitter. You can follow us on Twitter, also LinkedIn. We often post any new releases or specifically when we issue reports. So you can follow us through that social media. So to get started today, if I can figure out how to do the slides. Okay. So this just gives you an overview of what we're going to talk about. But we're going to kind of split up the presentation today. The first part of it, we're going to start with just giving you an overview of when we started this process and kind of how it has morphed over the years, some updates that we're now making or we have made to the process in 2018 versus when we first implemented it in 2017. And then we'll kind of talk about the first year, some of the localities that we identified and how we went about doing that. And specifically, one of the localities in Virginia, the City of Bristol, was one that we did some additional follow-up and discussions and more detailed review with them. And then out of that, we made a recommendation, our office did, to the Governor of Virginia that they were in need of some technical assistance. So I'll kind of stop my presentation at that point, and then the city manager, Randy Eads, will jump in on the call and kind of speak to the assistance they received and, kind of get a little bit more detailed on what the specific issues were, how they used that assistance, and kind of where they are today. And then I'll jump back in and finish out with some of the updates we've made to our monitoring system that we're using currently and moving forward to what we've done during the current year. So to go ahead and jump in. Oh, and one thing, and I know that Mary mentioned this earlier, feel free to use the chat function for any questions. Hopefully we'll have time towards the end to address any questions. But if not, my email address was on the previous slide. So feel free to send me any emails as needed, if you have any questions that we can help address. So to get started, this slide just gives you just some overall points on the background of how this process in the Commonwealth of Virginia has evolved. So we actually kind of started this process probably late 2016. The General Assembly, they were asking several questions of our office, trying to get a feel for the oversight and monitoring for financial reporting for localities that our office already was charged with doing. and kind of how we could build on that process, as Martha mentioned a few minutes ago. So the actual legislation behind this process in Virginia was actually established during the 2017 budget session. So it is actually part of our Virginia Acts of Assembly, which is our budget bill. And so it's added each year as part of our biennial budget bill, and it's at part 4-8.03. The next couple slides will give you just a quick overview of the main points behind the legislation and what it tasks our office to do, as well as kind of how the process moves forward. And specifically, this kind of originated because there was another city, the city of Petersburg in Virginia, that was going through some fiscal distress and some issues that was kind of unprecedented in our state. And that's when the General Assembly kind of realized that we didn't have a process in place and really needed to get a monitoring process in place. So this slide just gives you the overall points, again, as it's laid out in our legislation in the Virginia's budget bill, and gives the main points that our office has kind of been tasked with doing now. So at first, when we started the process, we got a work group together to just kind of get some information to establish what all might be the best methodology and way to proceed with this. And really, at the end of the day, we've been tasked with coming up with an early warning system and really an annual monitoring system where we're looking at this every year to try to see if we notice any patterns or any type of issues that we see throughout the years where we're seeing a locality might be headed into a not so great position from a fiscal distress point of view. So kind of what our process starts off with is just really evaluating key financial ratios that I know a lot of the states that are represented on the call today, we've met and discussed this on many occasions. So similar analysis to what a lot of you all are using. And that's really for us to get an idea if we see a locality not doing so good. And so that's kind of where the preliminary determination, where our legislation speaks to that. It's the idea is kind of behind what that annual monitoring of fiscal ratios and other qualitative factors. So if we get to a point where we make a preliminary determination and we talk to the locality and say, hey, this is what we're seeing, could we do some more extensive review and request some additional information? Because again, what's important about this is our office does not perform the annual audits of these localities. So we don't have that connection, like an auditor's connection with them, in order to understand some of the more nuances or even some of the way that they operate. So that's kind of why we have to take this next step and do an additional review with them. And at that point, the locality can say, no thanks, we don't want to do this, we're fine, or whatever it might be, and we move on in the process. And then we'll talk a little bit later, if we do see a locality that we feel like is going through some type of situation of distress, or something's going on that we feel like they warrant some type of state assistance, oversight, or targeted intervention, is what our legislation speaks to. That can happen. Our office has to make that formal recommendation to the governor and chairs of money committees before anything can proceed. And that's what this next slide speaks to. So that first part is our office is involved. Once it gets to this point, our office is not involved in actually making a decision of whether there's assistance, oversight, or intervention, or what that might be. That is all administered by the governor's office in consultation with the chairs of our money committees, as well as the Secretary of Finance's office here in Virginia. And kind of what the legislation speaks to from that perspective is, a formal plan has to be put in place as to what, either if it's assistance, oversight, or intervention, and what that might be. So that's where the City of Bristol will come in the next few minutes and talk a little bit more about their side of things and what they've seen with the state assistance. So we'll start off just to give you some quick background. And I know Lori and I had talked about this. I guess it's been a couple of years now when we had an annual meeting in Washington, D.C. With Pew Charitable Trusts. And just so we'll start off and give you a little bit of background for those on the call that's not familiar of where we started our process in the summer of 2017. And what we did kind of starting off calculating ratios, we borrowed the state of Louisiana's part of their financial assessment model, particularly the ratios that they calculate within their model. And really the main reason why we kind of started with that was back when we were first discussing what a process might look like and getting something put in place in Virginia. Of course, the locality that was in the news quite often was the city of Petersburg. So the state of Louisiana actually went out and got Petersburg's financial statements for several years, plugged their information from their audited financial statements into their model, and kind of they sent us the information and said, hey, this is kind of what their trends look like over the past few years through that current time. And, you know, we could clearly see that had we had this type of process in place, you could see the digression of the city of Petersburg. So we thought it was a good model, you know, very basic financial ratios to start off with, to at least just get some type of process and monitoring system in place here in Virginia. So that's what we used in 2017, and we calculated the financial ratios. It was 10 basic ratios from the government-wide statements and the governmental funds, primarily the general fund. And then we plugged in data for fiscal year 14 through fiscal year 16. And overall, I'm sure several of you are familiar with Louisiana's model, but it comes, the calculations within the model comes up with an overall FAM score, a percentage for each locality based on those ratio results. And that's what we used in 2017 to kind of guide our process of, are we seeing some localities that, again, out of this analysis, we weren't definitively saying these localities, because of their FAM score, means that they're fiscally distressed. It was only meant as a preliminary look to, hey, we see these localities, we want to get some additional information and perform some follow-up. And so we actually identified 8 localities as a result of this analysis. So from fiscal year 16 data, their trends, or maybe they had a low FAM score because we used a threshold of under 16% or under. So we identified 2 cities and 4 counties here in Virginia. That was all based on the ratio data. We also qualitatively pulled in 2 other cities at the time of this analysis. They were behind on their fiscal year 16 and fiscal year 17 audits. Those audits hadn't been completed and they hadn't issued their audited financial statements. So we kind of brought those 2 in from a qualitative basis because we couldn't analyze, you know, what their ratios might be. And so out of this process, you know, again, kind of what our internal process is to say, hey, this is just a first look at what we're looking at based solely on financial ratios. We would like to get additional information and perform additional follow-up with you. You know, would you like to participate? So this kind of gives you a quick background on what our follow-up process is meant to be. So it's all centered around a financial assessment questionnaire that we came up with. And so the questionnaire kind of is broadly looks at various areas, their budgeting process, you know, any kind of internal issues they might be having, whether it be system implementation or whatever it might be. And then we look at revenues, expenditures, just a variety of different things. We kind of use that as a guideline to help us look at any areas that where we might need to dig a little bit deeper. We actually make this questionnaire publicly available out on our websites. Really, we encourage any locality, particularly smaller localities in Virginia, small towns aren't required to have an annual audit. So I know some small towns have used this questionnaire kind of to help them internally know, maybe where to monitor their own internal processes. And then after we kind of go through the questionnaire, we have follow-up meetings, discussions, however many meetings or discussions we might need in order to get a better understanding. Usually also because of the timing of it, by this time, we have the most recently issued CAFR that we can also kind of look to, have they made improvements, what all has happened in the most recent audited year to kind of help us understand the ratio calculations. And then again, we either say, okay, based on this follow-up discussion and follow-up process, we've gotten a better understanding of what their ratios are showing and that, there's no issues going on that would warrant the state coming in and either giving assistance or some type of targeted intervention or oversight. Or the flip side to that is as the City of Bristol will talk about in the next few slides, if we do identify a locality that needs state assistance, we then make a determination from there. So this just gives you a quick overview of, again, 2017 was our first year throughout the entire process from start to finish. So again, out of those 8 localities that we talked to, 4 localities, so 1 city and 3 counties that actually went through the follow-up process with us. We made the determination that they weren't going through some type of situation or they weren't in whatever, something happening that would mean the state coming in and offering assistance or intervention. 1 county did decline to participate in our follow-up process. We have since followed up with them in the next year's process. They did elect to participate in our process. So that was, kind of good that came out of, we looked at their ratios again and they decided to go ahead and participate. Those 2 localities, those 2 cities that we qualitatively brought in, still at the time when we were wrapping up this process for this year, they were still behind in both of these fiscal year audits. So we stressed to them that it was more important for them to finish their audits and issue their CAFRs than to go through our process, and that we would basically defer them into the next future year's follow-up process. So March of last year, we published a comprehensive report about our first year of the implementation of this analysis and kind of the results of those reviews. And probably most importantly was throughout this process, it was a huge learning experience for all of us that are involved in this process and the follow-ups that we completed, and just getting more information from many of you all on the call today, the state offices that do similar processes. So it was a great learning experience. And we also received a lot of feedback from our localities of, maybe some things we could do better or we could change. And so really the report kind of spoke to what we would start implementing and changing in future years process and our analysis. So I'll talk about that a little bit later on. But I did give the link you can see there to the report out on our website if you're interested in that. So this next slide just kind of summarizes the overall primary issues that we saw. Again, the City of Bristol, which Mr. Eads is going to speak to this in a couple of minutes. They were the one locality that we did identify as our office recommending assistance to them. So we did make formal recommendation to the governor and chairs of money committees back towards the end of 2017. And you can see on this slide the primary issues that I'm sure Mr. Eads will speak to a little bit more really had to do with their solid waste disposal fund, which is an enterprise fund for the city, as well as their commercial development project called the Falls, and kind of the debt associated with that and how that project would continue and the future revenue streams it would bring in. And really, at the end of the day, what we were recommending was the state helping the city from a funding perspective in order to bring in some outside consultants to help them with these issues. So right now, I'm going to stop talking and turn it over to Randy Eads. And Randy, I'll let you introduce you and Tamara.
Okay, well, thank you. Everyone, I'm Randy Eads. I'm the city manager and the city attorney for Bristol, Virginia. First, I want to say thank you to the APA for giving us all the assistance they have over the past almost 2 years now in regards to our financial situation in Bristol. And I can't say thank you enough to Tamara Spradlin, my CFO. If it wasn't for her, I can guarantee you the city wouldn't be in the financial position that it's in right now. She's a tremendous CFO. She has a local government auditing background plus a local government background as well. And she is a tremendous CFO, so I don't want anyone to start headhunting her, please. First, I want to say to any locality that is listening out here, whatever you do, do not just look at how your community will make it to the end of the next fiscal year. It's easy for me to say that sitting in the chair that I'm in now. You can always Monday morning quarterback any decision that's made, but it appears that a lot of the decisions that were based on an analysis in Bristol were based on the fact, how do I make it to the next June 30th? And I can tell you from the chair that I'm sitting in, do not do that. If you are doing that, stop doing that now and start looking 3, 5, 7, and 10 years down the road as to where your locality will be in a fiscal situation. Also, I would highly recommend that you only do what local governments are supposed to do, and that's to provide for the health, safety, and welfare of your citizens. Do not get involved in projects or endeavors that you don't have the expertise to get involved in. That's where the city has found itself, and that's the two albatrosses that are around their neck right now. The city decided back in the mid to late 90s to get involved in a landfill. It's a rock quarry landfill, and for those of you who do not know what a rock quarry landfill is, basically they converted an old rock quarry into a landfill. And from the experts that we've talked to, we are the only rock quarry landfill in the United States. So we have a multitude of issues with that landfill. The second piece that we should have never been involved in was the falls. That was a retail development project, and that project has cost the city $84 million to date. I should say that the landfill has cost the city $77 million to date. The landfill, as long as we continue to own that, will eventually end up costing the city more than the Falls Retail Development Project ever will. So the state came out late August of 2017. I was 58 days into being the city manager for the city of Bristol, and released a report that the city was the most fiscally distressed locality in the Commonwealth. I'm not going to say that was a shock to me, but simply because I knew the amount of debt that we were facing and what we had to do to overcome that debt. I want to make sure that everyone understands we were able to pay our bills. It was not a cash flow issue. It was simply the amount of debt that the city of Bristol had around its neck that was just strangling us. So in order to kind of deal with these situations, myself, Tamara, and the APA, we worked together for 6 or 8 months. We came up with a plan, and the plan was for us to hire some outside consultants to look at our landfill, and then to hire an economist to look at the future of the city of Bristol and the surrounding area and what we need to do on an economic development standpoint. So we went out, we hired a set of engineers. They have come in, they've given us an analysis on the landfill. And basically what it boiled down to was the pure and simple fact that when they started the landfill in 1998 was the official start date, they were not charging the rates that needed to be charged in order to cover the costs associated with that landfill. So from the moment that landfill began, they were operating in the red. And over the course of roughly 15 years, they never had a significant rate increase. If it tells you anything, they started the rates out at $3 per month for individuals for us to collect their residential waste. And that was not sufficient to cover the cost of operating that landfill. The second piece of that puzzle is what do we do with it in the future, and how do we make it financially stable? Well, one, that's going to require us to raise rates, not only on our residential customers and with the city, but also our commercial contractors that we have that are dumping waste into our landfill on a daily basis. The practical aspect of raising the rates on the commercial contractors, there are other landfills in our region where they have that opportunity to go to. So it's a very, we're on thin ice when it comes to raising rates with certain commercial customers, because if we raise it too much, they are likely to pull their waste and go to another landfill, which would mean a loss in revenue to the landfill, which in turn means a potential rate increase on our citizens for their waste. So we have to have a very fine balancing act with that. The second piece of our problem was the Falls project. The Falls project came to light probably in late 2010, early 2011. What was happening, our local mall that had been in existence for about 40 years was dwindling. And many of you all probably see in your own communities now that the local malls are not what they used to be back in the 80s and 90s. They've moved to different shopping, outdoor retail centers. So that's what was happening in our region as well. And the mall produced about $4 million of revenue to the city on a yearly basis. City management started getting concerned, along with the elected officials. What are we going to do when we lose this revenue? So they said, let's build an outdoor retail development project. They began that project at the same time that a private developer began an outdoor retail project on the Tennessee side. And the Tennessee side, with private development, they were able to get their development up and going in roughly 18 to 24 months. They have close to 100 businesses in their retail development now. It is busy as it can be any day of the week. Our development has roughly 8 businesses in it currently. It's 35% developed, and that has been now a 7-year project, and it will probably continue to be another 5-year project to get that fully developed. So the piece that the APA provided for us was the fact that I wanted an economic study to determine, one, what is happening in Bristol on the economic development front, who do we need to be going after, what market sectors should we be searching for, not only now, but 3 years from now, 5 years from now, and 7 years from now. There's an ebb and a flow to every sector. And my goal is to be at the beginning of every one of those market sectors on the rise. I want to be able to go right now and say, I know that market will be on the rise in 3 years. I need to start recruiting those businesses now, so that when the current markets we have start taking a dip, we have other markets that are on the rise that will help make up for that dip. That study has been complete. We've received a draft of it within the past 10 days. We are reviewing that draft to see if there's anything else that needs to be added to that, and hopefully we'll have that finalized within the next week to 10 days. So those are the big things that the City of Bristol faced. If it wasn't for the APA, the money that they helped us obtain from the state, I can tell you that we probably would not have been able to implement some of the changes at the landfill this past budget season that we have implemented. It's been tremendous to be able to have experts come in, know the business, and tell us what we're doing wrong and tell us how to fix it. Did we do exactly what the experts said? No, because there's always a political piece to the problem. But we did make a significant stride this year, and I think we'll continue to make those strides over the next couple of 3 years to get that landfill in a better position than what it's in right now. The Falls, I'm actually at a conference right now, meeting with developers and retailers to recruit them to come to Bristol. It's just going to take hard work. We can't get discouraged, and we just have to understand that retail is not what retail used to be. And I think over time we'll make the Falls a success, but it's going to take hard work. And Tamara, if you have anything that you'd like to follow up on.
Sure, Mr. Eads, thank you. Hello, everyone. I'm Tamara Spradlin, the Chief Financial Officer with the City of Bristol. It's nice to be joining you all. Thank you for asking Bristol to be represented. And as Mr. Eads mentioned, although the City of Bristol was not pleased to be the most fiscally distressed locality in the Commonwealth, we immediately began a conversation with the Auditor of Public Accounts about what that really meant and what the path was forward for the City of Bristol. As mentioned by the APA, the Financial Assessment Questionnaire really helped us isolate what issues were causing us as a city to alert as to fiscal distress. And as Mr. Eads and the APA have mentioned, primarily it was the city's solid waste disposal fund and the debt related to a specific economic development project, also known as the FALL. At that point, we continued conversations with the Auditor of Public Accounts as to what resources were available for the City of Bristol. It's important that I mention here that the city really bought into the process because we could see the value of the process that the Auditor of Public Accounts had put out in front of us. As previously mentioned, we have been able to use state assistance to obtain by outside consultants a financial analysis of our solid waste disposal fund and an economic forecast. Both of these services were performed by outside experts, and certainly we have qualified staff within the City of Bristol, but we were able to get experts who this was their business, this was their industry providing these analysis. Both projects, as Mr. Eads mentioned, in final draft form, and we anticipate final reports shortly. And I will tell you, as Mr. Eads mentioned, the financial analysis of the solid waste disposal fund has been an integral part of the upcoming fiscal year 20 budgeting process. That analysis helped us use benchmarks for determining rates for fiscal year 20 and develop a long-term rate plan for upcoming fiscal years. It also helped the city communicate the issues with the governing body and hopefully the citizenry as well. So, Mr. Eads, that's really all I have to add to what you presented, unless there are specific questions.
Thanks to all three of you. I want to check in with Rachel. Do you have more in your presentation?
I do. Yeah, so we've got a few more slides that I'll finish up with kind of how we have moved forward with our process and what we're currently using for the analysis that for the annual process. So this next slide just kind of gives you an update on, as I mentioned before, when we first implemented it in 2017, we borrowed the ratio model from the state of Louisiana. And again, I think I mentioned this before too, we received a lot of feedback, not necessarily negative feedback, some of it was a little negative, but mainly just a lot of anxiety and people misinterpreting what our office was trying to do. I mean, the thing about our office, because, you know, we are subject to FOIA. If anybody asks us for information, we can't hold on to it. We have to turn it over. So some of the analysis in its infancy and what we were doing were released by some other associations. It got out in the media. So really the overall misinterpretation that was made was our use of the FAM score to kind of help us guide that preliminary look into a locality that we wanted to get some additional information. Some of the media around this area immediately interpreted that as saying, you know, these localities that fell below the FAM score threshold, the APA was immediately saying they were fiscally distressed, which was not our intent of using this analysis. The other kind of connotation behind it and really the anxiety that we received from most of the localities was, first of all, the idea that it was using a scoring. A lot of localities do not like that. So some localities that, and we do have several in this area that have their own pretty robust monitoring systems at the local level. So some were saying, oh, my score is not as high as it should be, or this locality is higher than me and I don't think they should be. We just received a lot of information like that. So really kind of what that model was doing with the ranking and comparison methodology of all the financial ratios and all the localities included in the model was kind of, we decided we wanted to move away from that and just really kind of alleviate a lot of the concerns and a lot of feedback that we continued to get, that we felt like, we could still calculate financial ratios, but move away from there being some type of overall score that we came up that was based on comparing one locality's ratio results against another's. So in 2018, it was almost like we started the process over from the beginning, because we spent a lot of time. And again, it was very helpful being part of this work group, because we were able to look to a lot of other state systems and processes that they use to kind of help guide what might be the best, decision for us to move forward. So at the end of the day, in 2018, we decided we kept a lot of the same type of financial ratios that the FAM model uses, but we moved away from calculating an overall score and letting that be the main dictator of whether we perform follow-up with a locality or not. And again, we moved away from how that model compares and ranks the various financial ratio results. And kind of in the meantime, because we did make pretty significant changes, a lot of localities were wondering what we were doing. So we put an overview, kind of summarized document out on our website. You can see the link to that. That just kind of spoke to how we were changing our process, what we were using, and going forward that we wouldn't be using the FAM score, because that was kind of the flip side to that is localities were misinterpreting that if they had a high FAM score, that the APA was saying they were fiscally healthy. And so we had a lot of presentations and follow-up to make sure localities realize that that's not the intent of what we're trying to analyze or measure. We're specifically looking for things that will give us an indication of potential stress, not that we're making a determination or giving an opinion on financial health. So again, that was another factor why we decided to move away from the idea of a FAM score. So this next slide just kind of gives you the overall concepts of what we're using now in our methodology. And we actually looked to the state of New York's, their fiscal stress monitoring and their analysis that they do with their ratios, and kind of the idea of the points based on how that ratio performs. We looked to New York's system for that. That was extremely helpful. So really, that's kind of overall what our analysis looks to now. We're still kind of the first go of it. We're still calculating your basic financial ratios. We did add a few more that we saw that some other states were using that we thought would be helpful in our analysis, particularly with some of the issues that we saw with the City of Bristol, specifically with the enterprise fund, that was their landfill. And then looking at debt, we currently didn't have any ratios that looked at debt. So we thought those would be some good analysis to bring in. And again, really at the end of the day, we calculate the ratios, the financial ratios for all localities. So in Virginia, that's structured as cities and counties in Virginia are required to have an annual audit, publish financial statements, and send that information and data to us. And then the towns in Virginia, those towns that are over a 3,500 population, or if they have a separate school system, we only have two towns that meet that criteria. So they, by code statute, state statute, are required to have an annual audit. All other towns under that threshold are not required to have an annual audit. So we do not, some of them do choose to, but we do not include them right now in this analysis. So overall, that's 171 local governments that we're looking at and calculating the ratios on. And so really we just kind of took, like I said, most of you are probably familiar with the state of New York's, because I know they've given presentations to this group. And so we're using same methodology of, depending on how that ratio performs, it gets points assigned to it, points-based scale. And we use some of the same methodology, the weighted points and how the points are allocated, similar to the state of New York. We also looked at ICMA's analysis, their financial condition analysis that they have published, as well as we met with the Virginia Resources Authority, which is an agency here in Virginia that provides financing to many local governments. And we met with them, and they kind of walked us through their internal analysis that they do, which a lot of it is based on kind of common industry benchmarks and bond rating type analysis. So we try to kind of capture all that in the best way possible, and also using our professional judgment, because there are some nuances with Virginia's localities. So kind of this is the first part of our analysis where we're calculating the financial ratios. And then as a result of those ratios, depending on how the localities fall out, how many points they score, which if they score a high number of points is an indicator that their performance in their ratios are weaker or at an undesirable position. So we use this analysis to then guide us to our second phase of our analysis, where we're looking more at demographic and some qualitative factors, because that was kind of another some feedback that we received from some of the localities' financial advisors, and just variety of organizations that we talked to was incorporating more of a qualitative demographic type analysis alongside our financial ratio calculations. So that's kind of the second stage of our analysis, but we're only performing that analysis on localities that come out of our ratio analysis as showing weaker ratios. So thankfully, we are not performing our demographic and qualitative analysis on all 171 localities, because we probably wouldn't get anything else accomplished in our office if we were doing that. So this next slide just gives you some of the specific things to when we, the first year we went through our financial ratios and kind of looked at the results of that. And again, based on feedback and further information and just understanding that we gained, we realized that, there were some adjustments we kind of need to make as we're plugging in the ratio data from the audited financial statements. So the biggest two areas that we are making adjustments for. So the first one is specific to how Virginia cities and counties, they issue the debt on behalf of their school system. So their school system is treated as a discrete component unit in their financial statements, which is not brought into our analysis. We're only analyzing the governmental and business type activities of the locality on the government-wide statements, and then their general fund on their governmental fund statements. So kind of what's unique in that regard is a locality, there is state statute that allows a locality to basically make a calculation to show if they want to go through the calculation. Since all the debt is shown on the localities, the governmental activities, they can make a calculation to show some of the assets, it's called tenancy in common, on the localities side of the column, if you will, versus all the assets being over in the discrete CU. A lot of the larger cities and counties do not go through this calculation because it's very cumbersome. So really at the end of the day, a lot of them are showing a negative unrestricted net position. And when you look at their balance sheet, they're very debt heavy and not having those capital assets to balance out that debt. So we have to go in and make adjustments for these specific localities. The downside to that is not all localities report or disclose this information very clearly. Some are very clear. They might have a no disclosure or even disclose it on the face of the statements. So this first year we had to go through, every 95 counties, 38 cities to analyze, do they do this calculation or not? And if not, how do we need to make adjustments in our ratios? And then the other thing we did is, again, a lot of the larger localities have separate rainy day funds or reserves funds specifically set aside. However, our ratios really focus mainly in looking at unassigned fund balance and assigned fund balance. So for those localities that do go through, they have policy in place to where they have a rainy day fund or a reserve fund. We are going in and accounting for those in order to, show that their ratios show a bit better that they are planning for, in the event of a revenue shortfall or some type of unforeseen situation. So those are the main areas that are kind of time consuming where we're manually adjusting the data. And again, I spoke to earlier, we did keep some of the 10 ratios that were in Louisiana's FAM model, but we also added in a few more, and that is what this next slide will show you. These are the main ratios that come from the government-wide statements. So again, probably some of the bigger ones that we changed and we added in this year that I spoke to was, several financial advisors and Virginia Resources Authority kind of spoke to us, wanting to bring into our analysis looking at debt. And again, that was something we learned from following up with the City of Bristol. So on an overall government-wide level, we're looking at total debt to total valuation. And then that last ratio looks at business type, enterprise funds, self-sufficiency. So again, this would have kind of piggybacking on what we learned with the City of Bristol. We thought this was important to see, would there be any other locality that has that type of enterprise fund like what the city is experiencing, where it's not self-supporting and it's not self-sufficient, and the general fund has continued to support it, and kind of what that might mean for a locality. And then this next slide gives you the ratios that primarily come from the general fund balance sheet and income statement. One ratio new ratio we brought in new this year was looking at the change in unassigned fund balance, and specifically that, shows a better picture when you see that over several years. And again, I know many states have this type of financial ratio as well. This was a huge factor in the city of Petersburg, where they were continually pulling from fund balance reserves in order to balance their budget. So this was a huge thing that had somebody been monitoring this for, the past 5 or 6 years, it would have been a huge red flag that popped up for them. So this was a new ratio that we brought in. Again, we're bringing in, looking at debt service payments. So some localities, some of the larger localities have a separate debt service fund. So in those cases, we're pulling the data from that fund as well. And then also localities interdependence on particularly state revenues, state aid that they're receiving, and kind of how does that compare to their total operating revenues. Do we see a pattern in some localities where they might need to be mindful of that? So as I mentioned earlier, so kind of what we call our first phase of our monitoring process is calculating those 12 ratios. And we do that across all localities. We're always going to be somewhat a year behind because we're basing it on the most recent CAFRs that we have. And then based on the ratio results and what we're seeing unique to any locality that might be scoring a high number of points because their ratios aren't performing too well, they then automatically move into this second assessment phase, where we're specifically looking at some demographic information, some qualitative factors, other analysis that Virginia agencies perform here in the Commonwealth. And then also any kind of external factors that our office often becomes aware of. Sometimes it's just by reading the news. We'll learn about things about a locality. Some localities are really good about just keeping our office updated if something major is going to happen. So just really kind of any external information that we would learn or become aware of that you're not going to be able to measure that in a financial ratio. So specifically, we're looking at some of the typical demographic type analysis, unemployment rate, and we're looking at a change over several years. Is it increasing or decreasing? The same with poverty rate. Is the population base growing or is it declining? Same with the tax base, changes in median household income, several things, easy demographic information that we can get our hands on. Also, the Virginia's Commission on Local Government, they are a part of this work group. I'm not sure if they're on the call today, but many of you have met David and Aline. So they also every year do a fiscal stress ranking, and they're basing that on localities' revenue capacity and effort. So we're using their analysis as well to, it's just another qualitative factor in this assessment phase of ours. Also, the Virginia's Department of Education, they do some calculations every year for the required local effort and match. So we're specifically looking at a locality's funding in excess of what they are required under Virginia Standards of Quality, SOQ, Standards of Quality, yeah. And so just kind of really just using that as a factor of, again, we're looking at over, several years, do we see them declining in the excess funding they can put towards education? If they're declining or if they're at a really low percentage, might that be an indicator that something's happening? So again, it's just another factor that we're considering. And then as I mentioned, anything unique to a specific locality. So any localities that fall into this phase after we do our ratio analysis, we analyze this data, we're looking at this type of assessment, qualitative assessment, and then from there, we then make a determination, okay, we've gotten some more information, we're looking at them through a different lens, it's not solely focused on financial ratios, and then we make a determination of, and I think that's what this next slide will show you, we'll make a determination of basically we put our localities into two buckets, if you will. Those, if we've done the qualitative assessment, if applicable, and they would then, if we don't think we need to get any more information or follow up because we don't see any potential concern, so we put them over in our category of no follow-up review needed. And then if we do identify a locality that's come out of our financial ratios as well as the qualitative assessment, then they kind of go into our yellow category of, we want to reach out to them, tell them about our analysis, and ask them to engage and further follow up with us through our assessment questionnaire and just through that follow-up process. And again, at this point, the legislation in Virginia speaks to a locality being able to opt out. They don't have to participate in this process with us. So the next slide will show you kind of out of what we changed in 2018. So we made those changes. We ran the updated model. We ran the updated qualitative analysis for the applicable localities. And off the top of my head, I want to say that maybe around 30 came out of our ratio analysis into our qualitative analysis. And then out of like that ballpark of 30, we identified 14 as, these were new localities. So some of our localities that we followed up with in the previous year, their ratios might still have been showing low, but we saw improvement and we had already followed up with them. So there's no point in continuing this process. We'll just continue to monitor them. So 14 new localities, 4 cities, 4 counties, and 6 towns came out of this new process where, again, same follow-up process where we reached out to them, gave them information on this analysis, gave them the actual data, that our ratio calculations and what we analyzed, and asked them if they wanted to follow up. All localities did elect to participate. Some are at different stages in the process. For the most part, we have completed follow-up with 11 localities, and we've made a determination that, you know, no assistance or intervention is needed because they're not going through some situation of distress that would warrant the state coming in with assistance or intervention. And then we had a couple localities that, just due to turnover and you know, they are trying to get through other processes before this follow-up process. So there's a couple that have deferred our process right now that we'll basically pick them up later this year when they have a little bit more time. And then really for most of the localities as well, which kind of helped us make our determination, we were able to already see their fiscal year 18, their most recent audited statements, and kind of see changes or improvements that they've made. So that helped our analysis as well. So it's really just kind of an ongoing cycle where as soon as we get the next year's fiscal year statements, we plug the data in, and we just start analyzing and going from there. So from our 2018 process, we are a bit further behind than what we had wanted to be. Again, speaking to just really kind of reinventing the wheels somewhat in our ratio analysis and the additional qualitative analysis. But the good thing is we won't be making any more changes from that end of things. And we actually have almost all of the fiscal year 18 data already in there. I've just got to go back in and do some additional analysis and make some adjustments for specific localities. So we are in the draft stage of finalizing our report about basically everything we changed in 2018, and then the follow-up that we've performed and the results of that analysis should be coming within the next week or so. So if you follow us on Twitter, you'll see a report release about that. I can also keep the group updated if you're interested in reading that report. It might kind of cohesively bring together some of what I spoke to today. And that is all I have for now. So I think this ends at 1. So we've got about 10 minutes or so for questions. Mary, if you wanted to go that route.
Yeah, that sounds great. Thank you so much, Rachel and Randy and Tamara. If you want, just to, while people are going to be typing in the chat box, just to confirm, the first question that came in was from the Treasury Department. It asked, what is replacement to the FAM ranking to determine the stress or risk? I believe your presentation, that question came in before you got to that part in your presentation. So I don't know if there's anything more to add to that at this point.
Yeah, I can just kind of reiterate. So basically what we did for that, since we have two different analysis that we're doing. So it's primarily the ratio points, overall ratio points. So this past year, we set it at a threshold of anyone that came above 30 points or more that they accumulated because of the results of their financial ratios. That then automatically bumped them over into where we would do additional qualitative analysis, look at that demographic information, that type of thing. And then really from that analysis, it was just our judgmental determination based on all of that, since that's not necessarily easily measured by looking at demographic and qualitative factors. So really at the end of the day, it's a judgment call that our office makes. After that analysis, we then move into whether they're selected. And still, at that point, it's important to point out that our office is only making a preliminary determination to perform further follow-up. Still at that point, we are not saying definitively whether a locality is fiscally distressed. we don't make that determination until we actually perform the follow-up with our questionnaire, have further discussions, and learn additional information. So hopefully that helped answer their question.
Okay. Also, the second question that came in from Ron Queen, looks like you may have also answered it. What is the lag time from the end of the year until the audited financial statements are available for your analysis? Did you mention that's about a year or so?
I did not. So state statute in Virginia, localities are required to have their audit complete and submit it to our office on November 30th each year after the end of the fiscal year end close on June 30th. So that is actually one thing we struggle with is a lot of localities don't meet that deadline. So that just further delays, not only because we also, in addition to this process, we publish a comparative report of all those localities' revenues and expenditures. They submit data to our office based on their audited financial statements in a specific format so we can comparatively show all cities, counties, and those towns required to have an audit, their various revenues and expenditures. So we have that report and this analysis kind of going on at the same time, and the further localities are delayed and completing their audit and submitting to us just throws our process further delayed. And that's where I spoke to earlier, where we had identified 2 specific localities because they had continued to be delayed in their required reporting to our office. So in a perfect world, it would be the early part of the next year, like January, February. If we get things timely, we can get the audited financial statements into our model and then go from there. But so far, the past 2 years, we have not gotten to that point quite yet. But that's the plan. Hopefully, we'll move towards that.
Okay. The next question again from Michigan Treasury has to do with how the data is collected. How do you collect the data that is used? Do you pull it from the audits, or do the locals submit it to you?
So right now, we are pulling it directly from their audited CAFRs. So it's data entry that we're doing. And really, that is mainly because, as Martha mentioned earlier when she was getting things started, we did not want to create another burden on localities, another state mandate that said, hey, we need you to put your data into this form so that we can populate our model. So currently we're pulling that from the audited financial statements. The other part to that too is, while we do receive data for our comparative report, it's in a completely different format, and it's not necessarily pulling in everything that we're trying to analyze in the financial ratios. So we may be able in future to somewhat migrate those 2 processes together, but right now we are not at that point. So our analysis is based solely on our data entry that we're pulling from the audited financial statements of those localities.
Okay. Can you remind me too, did you mention that your assessment questionnaire is publicly available on your website?
It is, and I can shoot you an email with that if you want to post that out there.
That would be great. Thank you. Also, I want to thank City Manager and Chief Financial Officer Tam Andy for your comments and sharing the situation that in the relationship, it really sounds like that you have developed with the APA. And it makes me want to be able to share your contact information with some specific locals here in the state of Michigan to help them come to a better understanding on some of these things that you've gone through.
You can feel free to share my contact information. I'm more than willing to have a conversation with anyone. I've seen what Bristol has gone through and what we will continue to go through for the foreseeable future. And no locality should ever have to go through the circumstances that we went through if it can be prevented. So feel free to share my contact information.
That's wonderful. Thank you for offering that.
And this is Tamara again, and please share mine as well.
Thank you. I was very pleased also to hear multiple times from Rachel. You mentioned the value that you have received, and I think others have received from participating in this the Sustainable Government Workgroup that's generously supported by Pew Charitable Trust. So I just wanted to, I appreciate you mentioning that, and I didn't even ask you or pay you to do that. So
No, you didn't. You did not twist my arm to say that, but it truly has been. I mean, we would have been completely lost if we were not exposed to a lot of just presentations and just being able to sit down one-on-one and chat with the work group. Being able to meet in person for those annual meetings was very helpful to our office to get an understanding of, some of the analysis and process that other states are already doing. So we didn't have to reinvent the wheel completely on our own. So it has been very helpful.
That's wonderful. I don't see any more questions coming in. I'm just glancing down the participants too. It doesn't look like anyone has trying to speak either, just in case. It looks like we may have an opportunity to end maybe a couple minutes early. I want to thank everyone, thank the presenters for your participation today. Again, we will go ahead and make this presentation available, and we have also recorded it. So we will make the recording available because it could also, I think, prove beneficial to folks. So again, thanks for everything, and enjoy the rest of your Monday. Take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.